It is the deadliest maritime disaster you have never heard of. Roughly 7,000 people died in a single afternoon, most of them Jewish concentration camp survivors who had survived Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Neuengamme only to be machine-gunned in the water by Allied aircraft. The British government classified the records for 100 years. This is the unfortunate true story of the SS Cap Arcona. Launched in 1927 by the Hamburg South America Line, she was a luxury ocean liner of 27,500 tons, designed to carry wealthy German passengers between Hamburg and Buenos Aires. For most of the 1930s, she was the pride of the German merchant fleet. She had teak decks, a ballroom, a swimming pool, and a reputation as one of the most elegant ships afloat. When the war began in 1939, the German Navy seized her. She spent most of the war as a stationary barracks ship in occupied Poland, used to house naval personnel. By the spring of 1945, her engines were worn out, her hull was rusting, and she was barely seaworthy. She should have been scrapped. Instead, in late April 1945, she was ordered to sail to the Bay of Lübeck on Germany's Baltic coast. There, she was to receive a new cargo. The cargo was human. By April 1945, the Nazi concentration camp system was collapsing. Soviet forces were closing in from the east. British and American forces were closing in from the west. SS commanders had been ordered by Heinrich Himmler to evacuate the camps and prevent prisoners from falling into Allied hands alive. What followed were the death marches. Tens of thousands of prisoners were forced to walk hundreds of miles westward in freezing conditions, with no food and no medical care. Anyone who collapsed was shot. An estimated 250,000 people died in these final months of evacuations. The prisoners of Neuengamme concentration camp, located near Hamburg, were marched to the port city of Lübeck. There, the SS made a decision that has never been fully explained. Instead of leaving the prisoners on land for the approaching British Army, they loaded them onto ships in the harbor. The Cap Arcona received approximately 4,500 prisoners. A second ship, the Thielbeck, received approximately 2,800. A third, the Athon, received around 2,000. The prisoners came from over 20 nationalities. Most were Jewish. Many had survived Auschwitz. All had been marched directly from Neuengamme to the docks. The ships were not provisioned for passengers. There was no food. There was no water. There were no toilets. Prisoners were packed into cargo holds and locked in. By the time British aircraft arrived overhead 3 days later, hundreds had already died of starvation, dehydration, and disease. What the SS intended to do with these ships has been debated by historians for 80 years. Some evidence suggests they planned to scuttle the ships in deep water to eliminate witnesses to Nazi crimes. Other evidence suggests they planned to sail to Norway. Neither plan was ever executed. The British Royal Air Force had received intelligence reports throughout late April 1945 that high-ranking SS officers and Nazi officials were attempting to flee Germany by sea. The reports indicated that ships in the Bay of Lübeck were being prepared to evacuate war criminals to Norway, where some German forces were still actively fighting. This intelligence was partially accurate. Several smaller vessels in the Baltic were indeed being used by escaping Nazis. But the intelligence reports made no specific distinction between escape vessels and prisoner transports. On May 2, 1945, a Swedish Red Cross representative named Paul de Blenay arrived at the British military headquarters in Lüneburg with critical information. He had been negotiating with the SS over the fate of the Neuengamme prisoners. He told British officers that the ships in the Bay of Lübeck contained concentration camp survivors, not escaping Nazis. The information was received by British staff officers. It was not transmitted to the RAF squadrons preparing to attack the ships the next morning. Why this happened has never been fully resolved. The most thorough post-war investigations concluded that the information was lost in the chaos of the final week of the war. The British Second Army was advancing rapidly, command structures were overwhelmed, and the RAF was operating under standing orders to attack any German naval target in the Baltic that might be used for evacuation. On the morning of May 3, 1945, 4 squadrons of Hawker Typhoon fighter bombers took off from airfields in northern Germany. Their target was the Bay of Lübeck. The first wave of typhoons reached the bay shortly after 2:30 in the afternoon. The pilots saw 3 large ships at anchor, the Cap Arcona, the Thielbeck, and the Athon. They had no information that these ships contained prisoners. The attack lasted less than 2 hours. It was conducted in 3 waves, using rockets, cannon fire, and bombs. The Thielbeck was hit first. Rockets struck her hull and superstructure. Within 45 minutes, she rolled over and sank. The cargo holds, locked from the outside by SS guards, became sealed tombs. Of the approximately 2,800 prisoners aboard, fewer than 50 survived. The Cap Arcona was attacked next. Her wooden interior fittings, the legacy of her years as a luxury liner, caught fire almost immediately. Prisoners trapped below decks were burned alive. Those who reached the upper decks faced an impossible choice. They could remain on the burning ship, or they could jump into water that was 7 degrees Celsius, just above freezing. Most jumped. Most drowned within minutes from cold shock or exhaustion. Many of the survivors who reached the surface were then strafed by RAF fighters, whose pilots had been instructed to prevent escape. The pilots could not see, from their cockpits at high speed, that the people in the water were wearing prison uniforms. The Cap Arcona burned for several hours before capsizing. Of the approximately 4,500 prisoners aboard, fewer than 350 survived. The Athon, the 3rd ship, was not attacked. Her captain raised a white flag and made it to shore. The 2,000 prisoners aboard her survived. The total death toll across the 2 attacked ships was approximately 7,000 people. It remains one of the largest single-day losses of civilian life in maritime history. The British government's response to the disaster was immediate and revealing. The records of the attack were classified. Initial RAF after-action reports were marked secret and removed from the standard archives. The pilots involved were not prosecuted, criticized, or even formally investigated. The official British position, maintained for decades, was that the attack had been a tragic mistake committed in the fog of war and that no one bore individual responsibility. The classification of the documents was set at 100 years. This meant they would not be released until 2045. Bodies from the disaster washed up on the beaches of the Baltic coast for the next 30 years. The last identifiable remains were recovered in 1971, 26 years after the sinking. Local German communities buried the dead in mass graves and erected memorials, often without official British or German government involvement. Some of the British documents were eventually released early, in the 1970s and 1980s, after persistent pressure from historians and from survivor groups. They confirmed what survivors had alleged for decades. The information that the ships contained prisoners had reached British command before the attack. It had not been transmitted to the pilots in time. The full archive remains partially sealed. Researchers who have examined the released portions have generally concluded that the disaster was not a deliberate war crime but a catastrophic failure of communication between intelligence officers and operational commanders during the most chaotic week of the European War. This conclusion has not satisfied everyone. Survivor organizations and some historians have argued that the rapid classification of the records, the lack of any formal inquiry, and the absence of public acknowledgement for decades suggest a deliberate institutional effort to bury the story. The Cap Arcona disaster killed more people than the sinking of the Titanic. It killed more people than the sinking of the Lusitania. It killed roughly the same number of people as died at Pearl Harbor. Almost no one outside Germany has heard of it. There are reasons for this. The disaster occurred 5 days before the end of the war in Europe. It was overshadowed almost immediately by the German surrender, the discovery of the death camps, and the beginning of the post-war reckoning. The British government had no interest in publicizing it. The German government, in the chaos of 1945, had no capacity to investigate it. The survivors were displaced persons from 20 different countries, scattered across post-war Europe with no organized voice. The dead were also, in a sense, doubly invisible. They had been concentration camp prisoners, written out of German society for years before they died. They had been killed not by the Nazis who imprisoned them but by the Allies who were coming to free them. Neither side had a political interest in remembering them. Today, a small memorial stands on the beach at Neustadt in Holstein, where many of the bodies washed ashore. A second memorial exists at the former Neuengamme camp. Each year on May 3rd, a few dozen people gather at these sites to read the names of the dead. That is the entire memorial for 7,000 people. The Cap Arcona disaster is not a story about villains. The SS men who locked the prisoners in the holds were villains, but they were peripheral to what happened on the afternoon of May 3, 1945. The British pilots who fired the rockets were not villains. They were doing their jobs, with the information they had been given, in the final week of the deadliest war in human history. The disaster is a story about what happens when systems fail in the chaos of collapse. About how 7,000 people who had survived everything the Third Reich could throw at them were killed by a clerical failure in a British headquarters office. It is also a story about who gets remembered. That is what really happened on the Cap Arcona. If you found this video valuable, consider subscribing for more deep dive history content covering the moments the official record forgot. Thank you for watching.